Welcome to Would You Consider? Now, this is the show where we find out what the topics are that everybody should be talking about and let our expert, Mark Dangelo, give us a good introduction. This time, we're talking about the explosion of AI tools that we're seeing all across the market right now and whether we're really prepared to see what's coming next. I'll join Mark right after this. Mark, thanks for being with me as always. I love it when you help us make sense of this stuff.
Oh, my pleasure, Rick. Thanks for having me.
So, AI tools, you can't look at any news outlet and not see something new popping up all the time. What is going on out there?
Well, I think, after almost 4 decades, AI has finally reached its embryonic stage where it's mainstreaming. It used to be AI was, neuroscientists. That's kind of how we looked at this. Neural networks, we said, okay, gee, this is where we're going to look at all the data prediction, using data to actually anticipate or come out with a intelligent solution. And for a number of decades, we didn't have that. And I think what's happened now is with the introduction of ChatGPT, the 3.5 version, and now the 4.0 version, that it's mainstreamed quicker than anybody ever thought. It took I think the term was 7 years to get to 100 million users. ChatGPT, it did that in roughly 2.5 months. Smartphones took 7 years. It's one of the fastest adoptions and bonding experiences that consumers have ever had. Henceforth, that it is actually driving into the business world to say, this is where the future is. Why aren't you doing this? So it's captured the imagination. We have the technology. We are developing chipsets. If you look at the current, like Intel versus NVIDIA versus AMD, NVIDIA has been the leader in this, and they've actually developed the chipsets that have automated the capabilities for conducting AI research, AI integration of all the data sources. So we are technologically at that inflection point where people are now being able to use this and mainstream it quicker than the old days when we had neural networks and the neuroscience underneath it. That took oftentimes years to do. Now we can do that in weeks and months.
Wow. So, does that mean it's all downhill from here, or do you see challenges?
I see a host of challenges, not the least of which are political challenges. Oftentimes, that's where what I often say, AI is going through a horns and halo effect. It's the halo, it's going to reinvent the world. The horns effect, it's going to destroy humankind.
Yeah. So, how can we tell which it is? Because it seems like that's an important distinction to make, Mark.
Well, the distinction is it's going to change the way we work. There's no doubt about it. We have data that every 2 to 2.5 years is doubling the amount of information digitally that's recorded in all of human history. So when you begin to look at this, every 2 years we're doubling on an exponential curve the amount of data that these AI routines can examine. And oftentimes, you look at that, what does that do to the caliber of how we work, how we conduct? And we were talking about this at a Thomson Reuters conference just this last week on the future of all things tax and accounting, something that is pretty mundane, pretty mainstream. You produce an audit report, you produce a tax report. But what we're finding is that AI has the potential, and that's how we should look at it, to actually eliminate oftentimes the tedious work effort that we're doing, producing work papers, producing trial balances, looking at the foundation for tax and accounting. And as the leaders were saying, these are leaders of international practices, the top 10, top 12 in the world. And they're basically saying, we now free up our individuals, our professionals, to actually do what they were set to do, not just produce papers. We can do that with AI. But if AI is trustworthy, we're confident in the information preceding it, what that's actually going to do is bring a greater work experience and greater skill expertise to analyze the information that AI is kicking out and then determine what to do with it. And that used to be maybe 20% of a person's time in the old days. Maybe that's going to be 60, 80% in the future. So it actually changes the discussion, changes the models, changes the returns.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I love about reading your work in NBA Newslink or wherever I find it, Mark, is that you always give us the graphics to kind of understand what you're talking about. And you wrote about this recently, about legacy models. Talk to us about how we should be looking at this.
Well, what you have in front of you on the screen, this is the traditional models. This is how we actually looked at system ideation, as they used to call it. And again, people, process, and technology. Those were always the three. And the intersections were kind of where the overlap was. That was the differentiating factor, those little overlaps in this Venn diagram. The skills, the scalability, the relevance. And really what happens is, as you begin to move from a system ideation into a data ideation, which is really what AI is all about, and we'll talk some more about this, that differentiation is no longer just in the systems that we provision, a Salesforce, a loan origination system, or a retail banking system, or whatever it may be, a healthcare system. It's how do we use that? What's the data telling us? And I was reading something first thing this morning on a Sunday that basically said, the doctors of the future are AI driven. Now, whether you believe that or not, that says the whole world of healthcare and as an industry could be radically transformed, because AI is providing that intelligent foundation. And then it would be up to the experts to interpret that to say, are you correct? And so this is where it's happening. I think it's actually going to change the way we work, much like we did the horse and buggy days into the automotive industry back 100 years ago. This is a fundamental shift in how we educate our people, reskill our aging workforces, and actually then begin to use that information in unique and ethically positive ways, versus the dystopian world, which is more of the doom and gloom, the horns effect, as I just talked about.
Yeah, which seems to be closer than I thought it was before I started this conversation with you. Now, many of these tools are going to require companies to get to the cloud, get more access to more computing power.
Mhm.
What impact is cloud provisioning going to have?
Well, cloud provisioning over the last 2 decades has been phenomenal. I mean, some of the returns of these vendors have been over 50% growth a year. That's beginning to flatten out as cloud maturity begins to take more and more of the budgets. Oftentimes for an organization, these cloud provisioning, these technologies are consuming nearly 50% of the budget. But what in a cloud world, as it matures for artificial intelligence, that allows us to stand up and provision capabilities that we couldn't do without having a cloud provider. For instance, I don't have the CapEx. I don't have the ability to go out and buy these NVIDIA chipsets or these advanced servers and ramp up using these, let's say we're talking like OpenAI, which is ChatGPT. I don't have an ability to generate all this capital to stand up these large language modules, which people find in the news and say, oh, that answers my question. But we don't have the capital. Cloud allows us to actually do that very quickly and economically. And then when we're done, we can actually unwind it. So we can build these test environments. We can build these training environments and train our algorithms much quicker than we could ever do if we try to do this internally by building our own data centers or creating racks in our own divisional operations that are going on. So cloud is the enabler. It's not the solution, but it's an enabler to actually make AI grow quicker and faster. Because of the specialization that they offer and the ability to stand up systems very quickly and also unwind them very quickly.
Yeah, now, Mark, in the past, at least the way I've studied management, companies looked to consumers, they tried to find out what their needs were, and then they built it. But now with AI moving so quickly, it almost seems like companies are building things and just throwing them like spaghetti up against the wall to see what sticks. What impact, if any, is the consumer having on this process?
Well, you got to realize that the consumer controls more and more of their information. There are privacy regulations, a patchwork quilt on a state level basis that are giving the consumer rights. And much of this was as a result of data aggregators, an industry unto itself, a very specialized industry, taking personal information, the exhaust, if you will, from our web searches, our systems of record, our public information, and knitting them together and selling it back into the third-party markets. Was that ethical? Was that actually accurate? Consumers stood up, and you had the European Union, you have the California Privacy Act, which is actually very closely tied to the EU privacy acts that were released about 2 years ago. All this information is coming to give the consumer rights. And one other thing that I think is interesting, especially in an AI world, as these consumers have this information, the question is, do we need to actually put that into our centralized repositories of how we design systems? Now, again, this is a key differentiated that consumers understand, but corporate America or corporates around the world have not understood, is that the idea of how we did systems were very centralized: data warehouses, data oceans, extraction, transformation loads, all this crazy stuff that fed these AI systems that were very traditional approaches to managing data, now are going into this distributed world. And this is where cloud computing really is. It's layers of clouds, not just one cloud. We have multiple providers, we have multiple solutions, technologies that run across those clouds. And now we are moving from that maturing industry to a decentralized world where the consumer now has access to that information. And think about what AI is. AI is a data-centric, data-driven, data as a product type of an approach. And when you begin to look at how systems were and corporate governance over those systems, they were very centralized. They were dealing with the aggregators. They were dealing with industry information. The consumer has now transformed that in this data-driven world where things are rising, as I said earlier, 2 to 2.5 times every couple of years. So that doubling, that effect is very pronounced on the consumers because they don't trust the corporations. Now, if we're talking about Apple, Apple's got some of the highest trust in the world. If you look at other corporations like healthcare or even financial services, they've probably been under half of their trust factor in the last 20 years. So consumer privacy, ethical sourcing of consumer assets, that is going to be the future, especially when it comes to AI. And that is different than what ChatGPT and all the rest of these generative AI type of models have used. They've used open public information across the internet. And I think we're going to see that transform as consumers say, hey, I don't want my information out there. I don't want you to use that for what you're doing. Because that's the change. And one last thing on the consumer and the interface is that when I talk to black hat and white hat kind of actors that work for Homeland and have this capability, they believe the only way to actually secure our privacy, stop ransomware, actually project AI that has trustworthiness factors, is that we're going to have to go to a privacy controlled by the consumer. And once we do that, we may actually stop some of the security challenges that we've got today, where we have these centralized systems and they're just like a candy store for criminals to come in and try to do something too.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. But that's going to change everything about the way corporations market to consumers. Because,
exactly.
Yeah, so that's it. All right, one more thing before I let you go. Everything we've talked about, it's moving so fast. I don't know if I would want to even be near the office of a CFO who was tasked with ensuring that they get an ROI and showing the numbers. Talk to us about what companies need to think about in this environment about the ROI of some of these new tools.
And today's ROI reality is, as we have in the screen in front of us, again, it's about the data. It's about integrating that information into oftentimes what people call a data fabric or a data mesh. And I think the culture of the organization is really key here, because as we talked about, the culture oftentimes was a system level culture. We think in terms of systems, apps or whatever. But when you begin to look at that and you begin to look at that diagram, the intersection points of those Venn diagram, that's really the key, and that's the differentiator, because now we begin to use building blocks, we begin to use layers. And so to get the ROI, it's not a one and done. It's not, let's think through a whole solution, and 10 months later we get the final outcome as we've done for traditional systems. AI is going to require ROIs and building block creation that is probably in that 30 to 90 day type of time frame, because it is data driven. And that is really going to be the key. And the other key that you're going to have there is, can I get transparency? AI is about machine learning algorithms, the data that actually went to feed it to create an outcome or an intelligent prediction. And those predictions oftentimes have no transparency. And so that's why you go into use a building block to generate your ROI, the core competencies of a corporation or an industry to use that information. Because if you do not, then what happens is when somebody comes back, especially a regulator and oversight, and it seems to be getting worse and worse as these AI regulations begin to stand up as bills and debated in various houses of Congress around the country and around the world, that if you don't understand how to unwind AI or how you got to that decision, it's not going to be a defense in a court of law or from a legal standpoint to say, well, AI did it, so I don't know what it did. You're going to have to be able to understand this. And that changes the whole ROI model and the timing that's associated with it. And I think those are the big things, because what we're talking about here is risk mitigation, risk management. And from a corporate CFO, from a board level perspective, those are key components. AI can help you do that, but it's a crawl, walk, run engineering mindset. You and I have talked about this in the past. I can think big. I can think about how AI is going to transform my workforce and the world and the halo effect of whatever, or in the horns, putting people out of work. But the reality is it's going to be something different. And those building blocks are going to change as time goes on, because AI technology is changing so rapidly.
I love it. Mark, I always love having conversations with you. We're going to do this again very soon, but now it's up to you. Would you consider talking to us about what you think is driving AI and AI development in your shop? We'd love to hear from you. Like and subscribe to see more like this, and we will see you next time on Would You Consider?